Imagine it is, I don't know, 2 a.m. on a Sunday, your phone rings. It's the night shift IT director, and he is just absolutely panicking.
Oh, that is never a good call to get.
Right. So a ransomware gang has just successfully breached your hospital network. They've dropped a payload, and it's currently encrypting the entire system. Electronic health records are locked, the MRI machines are down, heart monitors linked to the central nurses station are just going blind. And there's a text file on the main server demanding a $5 million payout in Bitcoin. So as the head of security, what is your very first move? I mean, do you call the FBI? Do you isolate the servers? Start negotiating.
Yeah, it's the ultimate nightmare scenario, right? And the answer almost always surprises people, especially if they come from a purely technical background. Because your first move isn't to touch a single computer.
Wait, really? You don't try to stop the encryption?
No, your first move is to coordinate with the chief medical officer to evacuate the critical care patients to a facility that actually has functioning telemetry. You have to secure human life first. The servers can burn for all you care in that exact moment.
Wow. And that right there, that pivot from, fix the blinking lights to protect the human beings in the business is exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to this deep dive into Domain 1 of the CISSP Security and Risk Management. For you listening, whether you're gearing up for the exam or you're stepping into a cybersecurity leadership role, this is your foundation. I mean, this single domain carries a massive 16% weight on the exam.
It really does. It's not just a chapter. It's the bedrock for literally everything else you will ever do in this field. You cannot adequately secure an organization if you don't understand the rules of the game. And those rules, they aren't written in Python or C++ Win, right? They're written in risk metrics, legal liabilities, and business strategy.
Exactly. So let's look at our stack of sources for today. We are pulling directly from the CISSP Domain 1 2024 objectives, and we're extracting the critical insights from the Cybex CISSP official study guide, 9th edition, specifically chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 19. And as we unpack all this material, we're going to apply a very specific thematic lens. The goal today isn't just to memorize a bunch of acronyms. You need to adopt what the industry calls the think like a manager perspective.
Right, and let's define what that actually means, because it is the secret to passing the exam and just surviving in the real world. Stepping back from the keyboard is hard for technicians. A technician configures a firewall to block port 23 because, Telnet is insecure.
Sure, which makes technical sense.
Right, but a manager asks, does blocking this port interrupt a legacy application that generates 40% of our quarterly revenue? And if so, how do we secure it without killing the business? A manager understands that security exists to enable the business, not to wrap it in so much bubble wrap that it literally can't move.
I love that. So before a manager can make those massive, high-stakes business decisions like what to do during a ransomware attack or how to balance security with revenue, they need a moral compass. You can't manage risk if you don't know the ethics governing your actions, and the source text puts a massive emphasis on the ISC2 Code of Professional Ethics.
It's mandatory for any CISSP, but what's absolutely fascinating and just critical to understand is that this code isn't just a loose collection of, inspirational quotes. It consists of 4 distinct canons, and they are ranked in exact, non-negotiable order of precedence.
Yeah, I want to pause right there because that blew my mind when I was reading chapter 19 of the study guide. The order actually matters. Like, it's a literal hierarchy.
It is a built-in conflict resolution mechanism. If you ever find yourself in a situation where 2 of these ethical canons conflict, you don't flip a coin, you don't ask your boss, you automatically follow the canon that comes first numerically.
Okay, let's put this to the test with a real-world scenario. Let's walk through them. Canon 1 is protect society, the common good, necessary public trust and confidence, and the infrastructure.
This is your ultimate directive. Essentially, do the right thing for the world. You have to put the common good ahead of your own career and even ahead of your employer's interests in extreme cases.
So if your company is, say, knowingly covering up a massive toxic chemical leak into a public water supply.
Exactly. And your boss tells you to delete the server logs proving it, Canon 1 dictates that your duty to society overrides your duty to your boss. And notably, literally any member of the general public can file a complaint against your certification under Canon 1.
Wow. Okay, so society and safety are at the very top. And we hit Canon 2, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally.
This one is primarily about following the law. But here is where it gets really murky for a global manager. The law is rarely simple. The sources point out a specific scenario. What happens if you're deploying a cryptographic system that crosses international borders and the laws of two different jurisdictions completely conflict?
Like doing something that is legally mandated in country A but is a felony in country B. How on earth do you resolve that?
The guidance here is that you prioritize the local jurisdiction from which you are actually performing the services. So if you're sitting at a desk in London, you follow UK law first and foremost. But again, you must act legally and justly. And just like Canon 1, any member of the public can file a claim against you under Canon 2 if they believe you're breaking the law.
Okay, that makes sense. Moving down the hierarchy to Canon 3. Provide diligent and competent service to principals.
Right. And principals here usually means your employer or your direct clients. This canon mandates that you actually know what you're doing. You don't overstate your qualifications. Don't pass yourself off as an expert in quantum cryptography if you just watched a 10-minute video on it.
Right. No faking it till you make it.
Exactly. You have to maintain your skills. And unlike the first two canons, only an employer or someone with a contractual relationship with you can file a complaint under Canon 3. The general public can't complain that you were late to a marketing meeting.
Right, right. And finally, Canon 4. Advance and protect the profession.
Basically, avoid negative publicity for the cybersecurity profession. Sponsor younger professionals. Act honorably in public forums. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the texts note that if you perfectly follow the first three canons protecting society, following the law, and serving your clients, you generally automatically comply with Canon 4. And anyone who holds a professional license or certification can file a complaint under this one.
So if we go back to my scenario where the boss asks you to delete the toxic spill logs, Canon 3 says, provide diligent service to your principal, meaning do what your boss says. But Canon 1 says, protect society. Because Canon 1 is numerically higher, you refuse to delete the logs. The hierarchy just solves the ethical dilemma for you.
Precisely. It removes the guesswork in high-stress situations.
That is a really solid compass. But once we have our ethics straight, we need to know what we are actually protecting. Which brings us to the fundamental security concepts in Chapter 1, the famous CIA triad. I feel like this is the one thing everyone knows, even if they aren't in IT.
Oh, absolutely. It's the absolute core of information security. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Every single security tool you ever purchase, implement, or audit is ultimately trying to protect one or more of these three pillars.
But let's dig deeper than the textbook definitions, because the source material brings up nuances that managers get wrong all the time. Let's start with confidentiality. It's about preventing unauthorized disclosure. But the texts make a really important distinction here. Confidentiality is not just about keeping secrets.
That's right. People hear confidentiality and they instantly think of James Bond and classified state secrets. But preserving confidentiality means protecting an asset, even if it isn't inherently a secret. It's about ensuring that only authorized subjects can view the data.
Like your medical history. It isn't a state secret, but it requires strict confidentiality.
Exactly. Then there is integrity. This is about preventing unauthorized alterations. The data must retain its veracity.
Integrity has two sides, right?
It does. We want to prevent malicious hackers from changing data, like altering the recipient account number on a wire transfer. But we also want to prevent authorized users from making unauthorized or accidental modifications. If a bank teller accidentally leans on their keyboard and adds an extra 0 to your withdrawal, that is a failure of integrity just as much as a hack is. We have to maintain the internal consistency of the database and the external consistency of the real-world object it represents.
That makes total sense. And the third pillar, availability. Making sure authorized subjects get timely, uninterrupted access.
Right. Because if a system is perfectly confidential, wrapped in 10 layers of encryption, and perfectly locked down against any changes, but it takes a doctor 45 minutes to log in to see a patient's chart, you have failed at availability. And in hospital, failing at availability means failing at life safety.
Which perfectly sets up this counter concept the sources detail. The DID triad.
DID, disclosure, alteration, destruction. These are the direct mirrored opposites of CIA.
So, disclosure is the failure of confidentiality. Alteration is the failure of integrity. And destruction, or denial of service, is the failure of availability. And the study guide warns about this trap that many new, overly enthusiastic managers fall into the danger of overprotection.
It is so common. You come in, you want to prove you're taking security seriously, so you crank every dial to 10. But if you think like a manager, you realize that overprotecting one pillar can fatally harm another. If you lock down confidentiality so tightly with endless multi-factor authentication hurdles and VPN requirements, you might severely restrict the availability for the remote workers who actually need to do their jobs to generate revenue. It is always, always a balancing act.
Yeah, you can't just lock the doors and throw away the key. Now, along with CIA, the sources highlight a couple of additions to the modern landscape: authenticity and non-repudiation. Authenticity is verifying the data is genuine and from its claimed source. But non-repudiation, let's sit on this one for a second because the legal implications are massive.
Non-repudiation ensures that a subject cannot deny an action occurred. Let's say a stockbroker authorizes a massive, highly risky trade. The market tanks, they lose millions, and they call the IT department screaming, "I never clicked that button, your system is broken."
Right, they try to shift the blame.
Exactly. But non-repudiation means the system has cryptographic proof, like a digital signature, that it was absolutely undeniably that specific broker. They cannot believably repudiate or deny the action.
And how do we actually build a system that guarantees that kind of non-repudiation? That transitions us right into the AAA framework. The 5 elements: identification, authentication, authorization, auditing, and accounting. I've always visualized this framework like going to a ridiculously high-end, exclusive nightclub.
I love this analogy. Walk us through the 5 steps at the nightclub.
Okay, so you walk up to the velvet rope. Identification is just you telling the bouncer your name. "Hi, I'm John Doe." You are merely claiming an identity. You haven't proven anything yet.
Right. Literally anyone can claim to be John Doe. That is why the next step is authentication.
Exactly. Authentication is when the bouncer looks at you, raises an eyebrow, and says, "Prove it." You hand over your government-issued driver's license. You're providing a factor, something you have to verify the claim you just made.
And once you're authenticated, does the bouncer just let you run wild in the club?
No. That is authorization. The bouncer checks his VIP clipboard. He confirms you are John Doe, but the clipboard says John Doe only gets access to the main dance floor, not the ultra-exclusive back lounge. Authorization is the system defining your specific permissions based on your proven identity. It dictates what you're actually allowed to do.
Perfect. Which leaves the final 2, auditing and accounting, which are often confused. How do they fit into the club?
Well, auditing is the network of security cameras inside the club, quietly recording everything you do while you're in there. They log your actions. Did you go to the bar? Did you try to sneak into the VIP room? The cameras just record. But accounting, or accountability, is the enforcement. It's at the end of the night when the bartender hands you a heavily itemized bar tab, tying all those expensive drinks directly back to your wallet. You are held accountable for your specific actions based on the logs generated during auditing.
That is a remarkably accurate way to visualize it. Every robust access control system needs all 5 of those steps. If you skip the cameras, the auditing, you can't enforce the bar tab, the accounting. And without accounting, you have 0 non-repudiation.
Okay, so we've got our triads and our nightclub framework. But how does this all fit into the actual corporate structure? The sources spend a lot of time on governance and alignment in Chapter 1.
Governance is where the think like a manager ethos really becomes reality. Governance is the framework that ensures security aligns with the overall business strategy, the mission, and the objectives. As we said earlier, security does not exist to say no. It exists to enable the business to take risks safely.
I understand the theory, but how is that actually documented? Like, if I'm a new CISO, where do I write this down?
Through security management planning, which relies on a hierarchy of 3 types of plans. First, the strategic plan. This is your long-term view, usually looking at about 5 years. It defines the organization's overarching security purpose. It includes major risk assessments and alignment with the 5-year business goals. You don't put firewall IP addresses in a strategic plan.
Right, it's a 30,000-foot view.
Next is the tactical plan. This is midterm, usually looking out about 1 year. It provides more details on how to accomplish those 5-year strategic goals. If the strategic goal is move to the cloud, the tactical plan is procure AWS instances and train staff by Q3.
And finally, the operational plan.
This is short-term and highly detailed. Think daily, weekly, or monthly tasks. Applying a specific security patch this Friday night is an operational plan.
And to execute these plans, you have to define very specific organizational roles, because the golden rule of business is, if everyone is responsible for security, no one is responsible. Let's run through these roles. We start at the top with senior management.
Senior management, like the CEO or the board of directors, holds the ultimate responsibility and liability for security. If the company is breached due to massive negligence, the CEO is the one who gets hauled in front of Congress or regulators. They must sign off on all policies to show top-down support.
Then you have the security professional, like the CISO or the security team.
They have the functional responsibility. They write the policies, research the tools, and figure out the implementation, acting on behalf of senior management.
Next is the asset owner, sometimes called the data owner or information owner. This one confused me at first. Who is this exactly?
This is a business leader, say the VP of Human Resources. They are ultimately responsible for classifying the information. The VP of HR determines that the employee's salary database is highly confidential. They decide what needs protecting.
But the VP of HR doesn't actually sit there configuring the database encryption, right?
No, that falls to the custodian. The custodian is usually in the IT department. They are the technicians who implement the prescribed protections, like running the daily backups and applying the AES-256 encryption that the asset owner demanded.
And then we have the user.
The end user accesses the system based on the principle of least privilege, meaning they only get the exact amount of access necessary to do their specific job and nothing more. And finally, you have the auditor, who is an independent party that reviews everything and verifies that the security policy is actually being followed.
Now, this governance also extends outside the company's four walls, right? The texts talk about third-party governance, because today, nobody builds everything in-house.
Exactly. You outsource your payroll to a cloud vendor, you use a third-party CRM, you use an external marketing agency. But here's the critical rule. You can outsource the work, but you cannot outsource the liability. If your payroll vendor gets hacked and loses your employees' social security numbers, regulators are coming after you, not just the vendor.
So how do you govern a company you don't even own?
Through aggressive oversight, document exchanges, reviewing their SISSP audit reports, establishing strict service level agreements, SLAs. In government spheres, this leads to a formal ATO, an authorization to operate. For example, under the FedRAMP framework, a cloud provider has to prove they meet rigorous baseline security standards before a federal agency will grant them an ATO.
Okay, before we move into the legal frameworks in Chapter 4, I have a major pushback. In Chapter 1, the text brings up these two terms constantly, due care and due diligence. Honestly, reading it just sounds like interchangeable corporate jargon, lawyers throwing words around. Is there actually a tangible difference between the two?
It's a fantastic question, and yes, there is a massive legal difference. It's one of the most tested concepts because it is so fundamental to liability. Due diligence is the research, the planning, the investigation. It's the act of establishing the policy and knowing what should be done. It's the management phase.
Okay, so due diligence is my team researching the threat landscape, deciding we need a firewall, and writing a policy that says all external traffic must be filtered by a firewall.
Exactly. You did your diligence. Due care, on the other hand, is the doing. It is practicing the individual daily activities that maintain that effort. Due care is the technician actually plugging the firewall in, configuring the rules, and reviewing the logs every single Friday.
So diligence is the plan, care is the action.
Right. And the golden rule here, the phrase to burn into your memory is, due diligence is the ability to prove due care. If you are ever taken to court after a breach, you use your due diligence documentation, your policies, your meeting notes to prove to a judge that you were consistently practicing due care. If you have the plan but didn't execute it, you failed at due care. If you executed controls randomly without a plan, you failed at due diligence. You need both to avoid negligence.
That makes total sense. And speaking of courtrooms and negligence, that brings us perfectly into the legal landscape. We just established all these internal rules, governance, ethics, policies. But what happens when our internal policies collide with external laws?
This is where the job gets incredibly stressful. As a manager, you have to navigate a labyrinth of local, federal, and international laws. And you have to know how to conduct investigations when things inevitably go wrong. And Chapter 19 explicitly lays out that not all investigations are created equal.
Right. The text lays out 5 specific categories of investigations. Let's break these down, because the rules of engagement completely change depending on which one you're in. The first is administrative.
Administrative investigations are internal. They have the lowest level of formality. Think of standard HR issues, an employee looking at inappropriate websites or operational troubleshooting for a server crash. The primary goal here isn't to put someone in jail. It's usually root cause analysis to fix a broken process or handle an internal policy violation. You gather the evidence, you interview people, you make an internal ruling.
But let's say during that administrative investigation, you realize the employee isn't just looking at bad websites, they're actively stealing and selling classified government documents. Now we escalate to a criminal investigation.
And this changes everything. Once you're working with law enforcement, the FBI, local police, the standard of proof becomes astronomical. To convict someone, the state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Which means the evidence handling has to be absolutely flawless.
Exactly. Your internal IT guy can't just copy files onto his personal thumb drive and hand it to the cops. Evidence must follow strict forensic standards, maintaining a flawless chain of custody, hashing files to prove integrity so it can hold up under cross-examination in a court of law. If you mess up the collection, the evidence is thrown out.
Then there's the third type, civil investigation. This is company versus company or person versus company, right? Like if our company sues a former employee for stealing our client list and giving it to a competitor.
Yes, civil cases are typically about lawsuits for monetary damages or injunctions. They do not involve criminality. Because nobody is going to prison, the standard of proof is much lower than in a criminal trial. It relies on the preponderance of the evidence, which essentially means more likely than not. If a jury believes there is a 51% chance the employee stole the list, you win the case.
That is a huge strategic difference from beyond a reasonable doubt. The fourth type is regulatory.
This is when a government regulatory body, like the SEC for finance or HIPAA auditors for healthcare, investigates your organization for a suspected infraction of their specific rules. You are legally required to comply with these investigations, and attempting to hide or destroy evidence during a regulatory probe is a massive separate offense.
And the final one is industry standards investigations.
A great example here is PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which governs how you handle credit card data. PCI DSS is not a federal law. It is a contractual standard created by the major credit card brands. But if you suspect a breach of card data, you're contractually obligated to investigate to assess your compliance, often bringing in specialized outside auditors. If you fail, Visa or MasterCard can simply revoke your ability to process credit cards, which would bankrupt most retail businesses overnight.
Let me ask you a very realistic strategic question here. Let's say a major corporation discovers that a senior vice president has been running a massive internal embezzlement fraud. They have the proof, but they desperately do not want this to become public knowledge because a scandal of this size will completely tank their stock price. How do they handle the investigation? Do they call the police?
That is the ultimate managerial tightrope, and it happens more often than you'd think. If you call in law enforcement to launch a criminal investigation, it almost certainly becomes public record. The media finds out, the stock plummets, the reputation is destroyed. Therefore, organizations often strongly prefer to handle things via internal administrative investigations or quiet civil lawsuits to control the narrative. They might fire the executive, force them to pay restitution civilly, and sweep it under the rug.
But what if law enforcement gets wind of it anyway and decides to investigate?
Then you are dealing with evidence collection under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable search and seizure. Law enforcement has a few ways to get your data. First is voluntary surrender, where management simply agrees to hand over the logs. Second is a subpoena, which is a court order compelling you to turn over specific data. A subpoena gives you time to collect it yourself.
But subpoenas give the company time to potentially lose the data, right?
Exactly. Which brings us to the third method. If law enforcement suspects you might destroy the evidence, they won't use a subpoena. They will show up at your data center unannounced with a search warrant signed by a judge, and they will physically confiscate your servers right then and there. And if they take your primary servers, your business is offline until you get them back, which could be months.
Wow. Okay, so it's definitely best to stay on the right side of the law and cooperate. Let's look at the actual federal laws we need to know as managers, starting with U.S. computer crime laws. The granddaddy of them all is the CFAA.
The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. This is the primary federal cybercrime bill in the United States. It essentially makes it a federal crime to access a computer without authorization or to exceed authorized access. It covers everything from trafficking passwords to committing fraud to causing damage through things like denial of service attacks.
And it was updated a decade later by the NIIPA, the National Information Infrastructure Protection Act of 1996.
Right, which broadened the CFAA to cover computer systems used in international commerce and elevated attacks on critical national infrastructure like power grids or railways to felonies.
Now, impartially speaking, based on the source text and legal history, The CFAA has faced some incredibly heavy criticism for being dangerously overbroad, hasn't it?
It has. The legal wording of exceeding authorized access is highly debated. The text specifically notes that under some strict interpretations, the CFAA could theoretically criminalize simply violating a website's terms of service.
Right, like if I share my streaming service password with my cousin, and the terms of service say household only, am I technically committing a federal hacking crime under the CFAA?
That is exactly the debate. The study guide mentions the tragic case of Aaron Swartz, the internet activist who was prosecuted heavily under the CFAA for bulk downloading academic papers from MIT's network, which he technically had a guest account for, but he used a script to download them faster than permitted. It also highlights Supreme Court cases like Van Buren or Sandvig v. Barr, which have debated whether violating terms of service truly constitutes a federal hacking crime. The courts have recently narrowed the interpretation to prevent regular people from becoming felons for terms of service violations, but it remains a highly complex law.
Moving on from the CFAA, we have FISMA, which requires federal agencies to implement formal comprehensive security programs. And then there's a fascinating piece of legislation called the Federal Sentencing Guidelines.
What's crucial for a manager to know about the federal sentencing guidelines is that they formalize the prudent person rule. This legally requires corporate executives to take personal responsibility for due care.
Explain the prudent person concept for us.
It basically asks a judge or jury to look at a CEO after a breach and ask, would a prudent, reasonable manager in the same situation have taken these same actions? If the answer is no, if a reasonable manager would have patched the server, but this CEO decided to save money and ignore the patch race, the executive can be held personally, legally liable for the breach.
So again, the CEO cannot just point a finger at the IT director and say, it's their fault. Let's shift gears from crime to property. Intellectual property, or IP. There are four main types we need to differentiate: copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. Let's start with copyrights.
Copyrights protect the expression of an idea, like a novel, a song, a painting, or importantly, in our field, source code. You can't copyright the idea of a word processor, but you can copyright the specific code you wrote to build yours. A copyright lasts for 70 years after the death of the author, or up to 120 years for corporate works.
But if I invent a new type of physical server chassis that cools twice as fast, a copyright doesn't help me. I need a patent.
Yes, patents protect actual inventions and discoveries, and they come in two main flavors. Utility patents protect how something functions, the actual mechanics of your server chassis, and those grant a 20-year monopoly. Design patents protect how an invention appears visually, and those last for 15 years. The trade-off is that to get a patent, you have to publicly disclose exactly how your invention works.
Got it. Trademarks are your brand identity words, slogans, logos, the golden arches of McDonald's, the Nike swoosh, the name Apple when applied to computers. They protect consumers from being confused about who made the product. And finally, trade secrets.
Trade secrets are the internal operating secrets of a firm. The classic example is the recipe for Coca-Cola, or Google's search algorithm. Unlike patents, you don't register a trade secret with the government. You just protect it fiercely internally with NDAs and access controls. They are immensely valuable, and they're protected in the U.S. by the Economic Espionage Act, which makes stealing trade secrets a federal crime.
When we talk about IP, we also have to talk about moving it across borders. Import and export controls.
The two big U.S. frameworks to know are ITAR and IR. ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, strictly controls the export of military and defense items. IR, the Export Administration Regulations, covers commercial items that have potential dual-use military applications. For example, strong cryptographic software was heavily regulated under IR for a long time because the government viewed strong encryption as a munition.
And globally, there's the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is a voluntary multinational agreement where countries agree to coordinate their export controls on conventional arms and dual-use goods, including cryptography.
Exactly. And you cannot talk about international borders today without talking about privacy laws. This is arguably the most complex part of a modern manager's job. Let's start with the absolute heavy hitter from Europe, GDPR.
The General Data Protection Regulation. The most important thing to understand about GDPR is its extraterritorial reach.
Yes. It doesn't matter if your company is headquartered in Texas, has no offices in Europe, and uses servers in Tokyo. If you're collecting, storing, or processing the personal data of European Union residents, GDPR applies to you.
And it has 7 core principles that managers have to build their databases around, right?
Yes. Lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, security, and accountability.
Let's make that real. What does data minimization actually look like for a manager?
It means you only collect what you absolutely need to complete the transaction. If you're running an online shoe store, you need the customer's name, address, and credit card. You do not need their social security number, their gender, or their political affiliation. If you collect data you don't need, you're violating GDPR.
GDPR also grants data subjects immense rights, like the right to opt out and the right to erasure, the famous right to be forgotten. But here is the scariest part for a manager: the breach notification timeline.
If you experience a data breach involving EU residents, you have exactly 72 hours from the moment you become aware of it to notify the regulatory authorities.
72 hours. If a breach happens on a Friday night, you have until Monday night to figure out what happened, who was affected, and draft a legal notification to European regulators. That is a brutal timeline if you don't have an incident response plan practiced and ready. Stateside, we don't have a federal equivalent yet, but we do have the CCPA in California.
The California Consumer Privacy Act. It applies to for-profit businesses doing business in California that cross certain revenue or data processing thresholds. It grants California residents specific rights over their data, often remembered by the acronym LOCKed.
Let's break down LOCKed. Limit use of sensitive data, opt out of the sale of their data, correct inaccurate information, know what is being collected about them, equal treatment even if they exercise their rights, and delete information. But again, how does a manager actually implement that delete right? If a user emails and says, delete my data, it's not just pressing one button, is it?
No, and that's a massive operational challenge. That user's data might be in your main CRM, but it's also in your marketing platform, your backup tapes, your customer support ticketing system, and 3 different analytical databases. To comply with CCPA or GDPR, a manager has to have a comprehensive data inventory. You have to know everywhere the data lives so you can comprehensively delete it across the entire enterprise.
Moving to sector-specific laws. For healthcare, we have IPIPA and its crucial expansion, HITech.
HIPAA protects protected health information, or PHI. HIPEC is crucial because it updated the laws for the digital age and significantly tightened the breach notification rules. Under HITEC, if a healthcare entity experiences a breach affecting more than 500 people, they must notify the affected individuals, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the prominent media in the area within 60 days of discovery.
We also have GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which forces financial institutions to protect consumer financial data and provide privacy notices, and COPPA for children.
The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. If a website or app caters to children under 13, it must get verifiable parental consent before collecting any data, and it must provide clear privacy notices.
And finally, on privacy, how do we legally move data between the U.S. and Europe? Because it seems like the rules change every 2 years.
It has been a massive legal roller coaster. For a long time, we used the EU-US Privacy Shield Agreement, but that was invalidated by a European court ruling known as Schrems II because the European courts felt U.S. intelligence agencies had too much access to the data. It caused panic in the tech industry. It has since been replaced by the EU-US Data Privacy Framework, or DPF. The takeaway for a manager is that transborder data flow mechanisms are highly volatile, and you have to rely on your legal team to stay constantly updated.
Okay, so we have established ethics, we've established internal governance, we've established external laws and privacy mandates. We have the perfect corporate machine. But all of this assumes the business is actually up and running. What happens when a Category 5 hurricane hits the primary data center? Or the ransomware gang from our opening hook takes everything offline? This brings us to business continuity planning, or BCP, in Chapter 3.
Laws and regulations are meant to protect data, but physical disasters or massive cyber events can halt business operations entirely. A manager's fundamental existential job is to ensure the business survives the worst-case scenario.
Now, the text makes a very clear, deliberate distinction between BCP and DRP, disaster recovery planning. I like to visualize this difference by thinking about a head chef running a highly popular, fully booked restaurant. Suddenly, the kitchen catches fire. The stove is destroyed, the sprinklers go off, the kitchen is flooded.
Okay, let's see how the 2 plans play out in the restaurant.
DRP is the tactical IT-focused side. In the restaurant, DRP is the maintenance crew running into the kitchen with fire extinguishers, putting out the flames, scrubbing the soot off the walls, and spending the next 10 hours repairing the stove so you could eventually cook hot food again. It's about fixing the broken systems. But BCP is the strategic, high-level business pivot. It's the chef realizing the stove is dead, so they instantly roll the prep carts out to the outdoor patio, break out the cured meats and cheeses, and start serving cold tops and wine so the restaurant doesn't lose a Saturday night's revenue while the kitchen is broken.
That is a brilliant way to separate them. DRP fixes the servers, BCP keeps the business alive and generating value while the servers are being fixed.
But before we even think about fixing servers or serving tapas, what is the absolute ultimate priority when a disaster strikes?
I cannot emphasize this heavily enough to anyone listening. The absolute #1 non-negotiable priority of both BCP and DRP is always life safety. Period. Full stop. You get people out of harm's way first. If the building is shaking from an earthquake, you do not tell your sysadmin to stay behind and initiate a database backup. You evacuate. You don't worry about hardware until every human being is accounted for and safe.
Once people are safe, BCP relies on some very specific time metrics generated during a phase called the Business Impact Analysis, or BIA. This is where we get into the alphabet soup of recovery. Let's walk through a timeline scenario to make this real. Let's say a hurricane hits our data center at 8:00 a.m. on a Monday. Boom, everything goes dark.
Okay, the clock starts right now. The first metric we need to know is MTD, or MED. Maximum tolerable downtime or maximum allowable downtime.
And what does that mean for our business?
This is the absolute maximum amount of time your organization can survive an interruption before it ceases to be a viable enterprise. It is the time until bankruptcy. Let's say the business leaders determine during the BIA that if our e-commerce site is down for 5 days, we will lose so many customers and so much revenue that we will have to close the company permanently. Your MTD is 5 days. You have exactly 5 days from Monday at 8:00 a.m. to save the company.
Okay, so the IT team gets to work. This brings in the next metric, RTO.
Recovery time objective. This is how long it takes the IT department to recover the bare metal systems and services to a defined level. It's the time it takes to buy new servers, rack them, power them on, and load the base operating systems.
Okay, so I am the CEO. I walk into the IT room on Wednesday at 8 a.m. It took them 48 hours. The servers have blinking green lights. Windows is booted up. I say, great, the RTO was 48 hours. We were fully recovered. Am I right?
Absolutely not. Turning the server on isn't enough. It's just an empty box. This is the most common mistake people make, and it brings in the third metric, WRT, or work recovery time.
What happens during WRT?
WRT is the time needed by the business units and database admins to configure the recovered system. They have to restore the data from the backup tapes, configure the application settings, test the software to make sure it isn't corrupted, and finally open the ports so end users can log in.
And this gives us a critical mathematical equation for survival. RTO plus WRT must be less than or equal to MTD.
Exactly. Let's look at our timeline. It took IT 2 days to rebuild the servers, that's RTO. Now it takes the database team another 4 days to restore petabytes of data and test the applications, that's WRT. Your total recovery time is 6 days. But remember, your maximum tolerable downtime, MTD, was only 5 days.
So even though IT fixed the servers, the business basically died on Friday while waiting for the data to load.
Precisely. Your recovery timeline RTO plus WRT must always fit safely inside your maximum survival timeline -MTD. If it doesn't, you need to spend money on faster backup solutions or alternate hot sites.
We also have one metric looking backward in time, RPO.
Recovery point objective. This measures acceptable data loss in time. If your RPO is 4 hours, it means the business can tolerate losing the last 4 hours of transactional data before the disaster. This directly dictates your backup schedule. If your RPO is 4 hours, you better be taking snapshots or backing up your data at least every 4 hours. If you only back up once a day at midnight and the hurricane hits at 4 p.m., you just lost 16 hours of data, which violates your 4-hour RPO.
So what does the actual BCP process look like to figure all this out? The study guide outlines a formal 4-step process.
First is project scope and planning. This requires absolute endorsement from senior management. If the CEO doesn't care, nobody will care. You need a solid business case to secure funding. Second, you form the BCP team. And critically, this must include both IT representatives and business unit leaders. You cannot do this in an IT silo. IT knows how long a server takes to boot, but only the head of sales knows how much revenue is lost per hour if the CRM is down.
Right. Third is the continuity strategy development.
This is deciding which risks to actually mitigate based on the BIA we just discussed. And fourth is provisions and processes. This involves creating the actual continuity of operations plan, or COPE. The COPE focuses on how the organization will carry out its critical functions for up to 1 month of sustained operations. It also includes establishing a vital records program so you don't lose your most important corporate documents like articles of incorporation or employee contracts in a physical disaster.
Okay, we've planned extensively for external disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, hackers. But let's look closer to home, because as we know, often the biggest threats are already inside the building. This brings us to personnel security and internal administrative controls in Chapter 2.
People are widely considered the weakest link in security, but with good management, they can become your strongest security asset. We have to look at the entire personnel lifecycle, from before they are hired to after they leave.
It starts with candidate screening.
Background checks, verifying education degrees, calling references. You have to know who you're granting access to. If you're hiring a chief financial officer, you probably want to run a credit check to ensure they aren't buried in massive gambling debt, which could make them a prime target for bribery or embezzlement.
Then comes onboarding. This is where you establish the rules of engagement.
Right. They must sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, to legally protect corporate confidentiality, and they must sign AUP's acceptable use policies. An AUP explicitly tells the employee what they are allowed and not allowed to do on company equipment. You can't fire someone for mining cryptocurrency on company servers if you never made them sign a policy saying they couldn't.
What happens when someone gets promoted or changes departments? The texts call this transfers.
This is a huge, often overlooked vulnerability point. Let's say Bob moves from accounting to HR. When Bob changes roles, IT usually rushes to give him access to the HR folder so he can do his new job. But they almost always forget to remove his access to the accounting folders.
Which means Bob now has the access of 2 different departments.
Exactly. And over 5 years, Bob transfers 3 more times, accumulating permissions like snow on a snowball. We call this privilege creep. It severely violates the principle of least privilege and creates massive unnecessary risk. If Bob's account gets compromised by a hacker, the hacker now has access to half the company instead of just one department. Access reviews must occur during every transfer.
And eventually everyone leaves. Termination or offboarding.
There are 2 flavors: friendly and hostile. In a friendly termination, someone retiring or taking a new job, you do an exit interview and turn off their accounts at the end of their last day. But in a hostile termination, say, firing someone for misconduct access revocation must be absolutely immediate, sometimes while they are still in the HR office being given the news. They must be physically escorted out by security to ensure they don't walk back to their desk and sabotage a server or steal a client list on their way to the door.
We also need internal controls to prevent employees from committing fraud while they're actively working. These are called administrative controls. The first is separation of duties, or SOD.
SOD ensures that no single person has total end-to-end control over a critical or sensitive function. If you're the person who writes the checks to vendors, you absolutely should not be the person who is authorized to approve those checks. If one person can do both, they can just write checks to a fake company they own and approve them. SOD forces collusion. If someone wants to commit fraud, they have to convince another employee to help them, which drastically raises the risk of getting caught.
Then there's dual control.
Think of this like the movies where 2 generals have to turn 2 separate keys simultaneously to launch a nuclear missile. 2 people must act together to perform a single, highly sensitive action.
Split knowledge.
This is when 2 people hold different halves of a secret. For example, half of a cryptographic key is given to the CEO and the other half to the CFO. Neither can decrypt the master database alone.
Dobertation.
Moving employees between different roles every few months, it reduces burnout, it cross-trains your staff so you aren't crippled if someone quits, and crucially for security, it makes it incredibly difficult for someone to run a long-term fraud scheme, because eventually someone else will cycle into their job, look at their books, and spot the irregularities.
And that leads to a control that always makes me push back when I see it in a security textbook. Mandatory vacations. I've got to be honest, mandatory vacations just sounds like a fantastic HR perk to prevent employee burnout.
Yeah.
How on earth is my boss forcing me to go to Hawaii for 2 straight weeks? A security control.
It sounds like a pure perk, but it's actually a highly effective detective administrative control.
Walk me through how me being on a beach detects fraud.
Let's say an employee is running a complex fraud scheme, a rolling embezzlement, where they're covering up stolen money by shifting funds between accounts every few days. To keep that scheme hidden, they have to constantly babysit it. They can never take a day off, or the whole house of cards collapses. If HR policy forces them to completely disconnect from the network for 2 continuous weeks, they cannot maintain the cover-up. Someone else has to sit at their desk and do their job. Without the fraudster there to cover their tracks, the replacement employee quickly notices that the accounts don't balance and the ongoing fraud is exposed.
Wow, so I'm not going to Hawaii to relax. I'm going so my boss can quietly audit my desk.
Exactly. It exposes collusion, embezzlement, and ongoing anomalies. It forces the system to operate without that specific human dependency.
Okay, so we've got BCP, alternate sites, background checks, dual control systems, fire suppression. All these controls cost money. A manager has to justify that massive security spend to the executives. How do we figure out mathematically what is worth spending? That transitions us into quantitative and qualitative risk analysis and frameworks.
To justify security spending, we use risk analysis, and we can do this mathematically using quantitative risk math. The CISSP exam and the real-world boardroom both expect you to know these formulas cold.
Let's lay out the exact formulas. I'm going to try to calculate this on the fly. First, we need to know how much a single disaster costs us. The metric is SLE, single loss expectancy.
Correct. The formula is SLE equals asset value AV multiplied by the exposure factor EF.
Okay, let's say we have a massive database server worth $100,000. That is the asset value. The exposure factor is the percentage of loss we expect if a specific risk, let's say a server room fire, is realized. If the fire would destroy 50% of the server's hardware value before the sprinklers put it out, the EF is 50% or 0.5. So $100,000 times 0.5 means our single loss expectancy, our SLE, is $50,000 per fire. Every time a fire happens, we lose 50 grand.
Perfect. But a fire doesn't happen every single day. To budget for it, we need to annualize it. This brings us to ALE, annualized loss expectancy.
The formula for ALE is SLE multiplied by ARO, the annualized rate of occurrence. How often does the fire happen in a given year? If historical data says a fire happens once every 10 years, our ARO is 1 divided by 10, which is 0.1. So we take our $50,000 SLE, multiply it by 0.1, and our ALE is $5,000. On average, over a decade, we lose $5,000 a year to this fire risk.
Exactly. You now have a hard dollar figure representing your annual risk, and this is where the manager makes their money. The safeguard cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, let's say a vendor offers me an advanced, clean agent fire suppression system that will completely prevent this fire damage. The vendor wants $6,000 a year in maintenance fees. Since it stops the fire, I'm saving the $5,000 ALE, so I buy it, right?
Wait, run the final value formula first. The value of a safeguard equals the ALE prior to the safeguard, $5,000, minus the ALE post-safeguard, which is now 0. Because the system is perfect. So you save $5,000, but then you must subtract the annual cost of the safeguard ACS, which you said is $6,000? Ah, $5,000 minus $6,000 is negative $1,000.
Exactly. Because the value is negative $1,000, you are spending more money to protect the asset than the asset is actually losing over time. A good manager rejects that safeguard. You never spend $6,000 a year to protect against a $5,000 annual loss.
We also have equations for defining risk itself, total risk.
Total risk equals threat times vulnerability times asset value. This is the massive, scary baseline number showing what your risk is if absolutely no safeguards exist in the environment whatsoever.
But we do have safeguards. The amount of risk those safeguards eliminate is called the controls gap.
Right, and whatever risk is left over after the safeguards are applied is called residual risk. The formula is residual risk equals total risk minus the controls gap. Residual risk is the risk that senior management explicitly signs off on and chooses to accept, because mitigating it further would be cost prohibitive. Now, I have to question the math here. You laid out that quantitative formula perfectly, SLE, ALE, ERO. But in the real world, can you really put an exact pinpoint dollar value on an asset value if it includes something intangible like company reputation or the loss of public trust after a data breach? Isn't quantitative math just a highly sophisticated guess masquerading as hard science?
That's a very valid critique, and it's exactly why purely quantitative risk analysis rarely works in a vacuum. You're right, you cannot easily quantify the exact dollar value of a loss of public trust. Is it $1 million, $10 million? It's subjective. That is where qualitative risk analysis comes in.
How does qualitative work?
Qualitative uses scenarios, gut feelings, expert intuition, brainstorming, and ranking matrices like high, medium, low, or a traffic light system of red, yellow, green. Most mature organizations use a hybrid approach. They use qualitative analysis first to quickly rank and prioritize dozens of risks. Once they identify the red or high-tier risks, they apply quantitative math to those specific items to justify the budget request to the board, using best guess estimates for the intangibles.
Once we analyze the risk, whether quantitatively or qualitatively, we have to respond to it. Management has 6 specific risk responses they can choose from.
Yes, let's list them. Mitigation means reducing the risk by implementing controls, like putting a firewall in front of a web server. Transference, sometimes called assignment, means shifting the financial burden of the risk to a third party, almost always by buying cybersecurity insurance.
Avoidance means stopping the risky activity entirely. If we determine that opening a branch office in a highly volatile war zone is too risky, we just don't open the office.
Acceptance means the cost of the control outweighs the potential loss, like our $6,000 fire system for a $5,000 risk. Management formally accepts the residual risk. Deterrence involves implementing visible controls like warning banners on a login screen or physical cameras on a fence to scare off casual attackers.
And then there's the 6th one, rejection.
Rejection is simply ignoring the risk, pretending it doesn't exist, and hoping nothing bad happens. It's critical to know that rejection is always an unacceptable response, and it legally violates the principle of due care we talked about earlier.
To organize all these risk processes, we rely on established risk frameworks. The big one heavily featured for U.S. government and defense contractors is the NIST Risk Management Framework, NIST SP 837.
The RMF is a continuous cyclical process with 7 distinct steps. Prepare the organization, categorize the information system based on impact, select the baseline security controls, implement the controls, assess if they are operating correctly, authorize the system, that's the ATO we mentioned in governance, and finally, monitor the system continuously.
We can also measure how mature an organization's overall risk program is using risk maturity models, or RMM.
RMM traces an organization's maturity through 5 levels. You start at the bottom at ad hoc, which is pure chaos, no processes, just reacting to fires. Then preliminary, where you have loose, undocumented attempts at risk management. Defined, where a standard framework is adopted organization-wide. Integrated, where risk metrics actually drive business strategy. And finally, the top tier is optimized, where the focus shifts from merely reacting to threats to strategically achieving business objectives and continuously integrating lessons learned.
Okay, we've done the math. We know our risks. We have our maturity models. But how do we figure out how the bad guys are actually going to come at us? How do they plan to exploit those vulnerabilities? That transitions us into threat modeling, supply chain risk management, and set of programs in chapters 1 and 2.
Once you've assessed your risk internally, you have to actively model how adversaries will try to attack you externally. Threat modeling can be proactive, which is a defensive approach done during the early design and architecture phase of software development, or it can be reactive, which is an adversarial approach, like penetration testing, done after a product is already built and deployed.
The most famous threat model, which is heavily tested, comes from Microsoft, STRIDE.
STRIDE is an acronym used to categorize the different types of threats an application might face. Spoofing identity, tampering with data, repudiation of actions, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege.
Let's break down that last one, elevation of privilege, because it sounds complex, but it's devastating. How does that actually work in practice?
Imagine a basic user logs into a web application. They have standard read-only permissions. But they notice that the URL says user role equals guest. They manually change the word guest to admin and hit enter. Because the software wasn't designed securely, the application blindly accepts the change and suddenly grants them full administrative control over the entire database. That is elevation of privilege. A proactive threat model would have caught that flaw during the design phase before a single line of code was written.
Once you identify the threats using STRIDE, you need to prioritize them because you can't fix everything at once.
Yeah.
This uses another Microsoft model, DREAD.
DREAD scores identified threats based on 5 categories. Damage potential, how bad is it? Reproducibility, how easy is it to do it again? Exploitability, how much skill does the attacker need? Affected users, does this hit 1 person or 1 million? And discoverability, how easy is the flaw to find?
There are other models the sources mentioned too. POSTA is a 7-stage risk-centric model. VSD integrates threat modeling specifically into agile programming environments. And then there's MITRE ATD and CK.
MITRE AT and CK is brilliant and universally used in modern security operations centers. It's a globally accessible knowledge base documenting real-world adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures known as TTPs. It is essentially a living encyclopedia of exactly how advanced persistent threats and state-sponsored hackers operate in the wild. You use it to map your defenses against known, real-world attack behaviors.
But threats don't just come from shadowy hackers trying to guess your passwords. Often they walk right in through the front door, wrapped in shrink wrap, via the products you legally buy. Supply chain risk management, or SCRM.
Supply chains are massive, incredibly complex, and largely opaque threat vectors. You're inheriting the risk of every single company that contributed a part to your final product. We're talking about physical product tampering during shipping, counterfeit hardware inserted at a warehouse, or malicious software implants buried deep in a third-party application update.
How do we mitigate that? If I buy a server, how do I know it wasn't tampered with in transit?
At the hardware level, we use a silicon root of trust, which is a hardware-based, cryptographically secure foundation built directly into the microchip that ensures the system startup process hasn't been altered. We also use PUFs, physically unclonable functions. A PUF acts as a unique digital fingerprint for a microcircuit, proving it is genuine and hasn't been swapped out for a counterfeit.
And for software supply chains, the major defensive tool right now is an SBOM, a software bill of materials. I always compare an SBOM to the ingredients label on a box of breakfast cereal.
Elaborate on that, it's a great visual.
Well, let's say a major health organization suddenly announces on the morning news that a specific artificial red food dye causes severe illness. If you're a parent, you instantly grab your cereal box from the pantry, flip it over, and check the ingredients label to see if your kids just ingested that specific red dye. An SBOM does exactly that for enterprise software. Modern software isn't written from scratch, it's stitched together using dozens of free open-source libraries. An FBOM is a highly detailed, machine-readable list of all those open-source libraries and dependencies bundled into the application you just bought.
Right. So when a massive zero-day vulnerability drops, like the infamous Log4j crisis a few years ago, where an obscure logging library used by half the internet was found to be totally compromised, an organization doesn't have to guess if they are vulnerable.
Exactly. They don't panic. They just query their SBOM ingredients labels across their entire network to instantly see if they've ingested the vulnerability allergen through their supply chain. If Log4j is on the list, they patch it immediately. Without an SBOM, you're flying completely blind during a supply chain crisis.
That is a perfect analogy. You also mitigate vendor risk through aggressive vendor SLA auditing, constantly reviewing your third-party providers' policies, their SOC reports, and their incident response plans to ensure they're taking security as seriously as you are.
We've covered hardware and software threats. Let's finish with the humans again. We talked about personnel controls, like mandatory vacations. But how do we actually teach them not to click on bad links in the first place? Setup programs, security education, training, and awareness.
A lot of people use these terms interchangeably, but the CISSP strictly differentiates these three concepts, and a manager must know the difference to allocate budget effectively. Let's start with awareness. Awareness is the what? It's broad general knowledge. It's teaching users to recognize threats, like spotting a phishing email with a misspelled domain, or knowing not to plug in a random free USB drive they found in the company parking lot because it might be loaded with malware.
Then training is the how.
Exactly. Training is tactical and specific to a role. It's teaching users exactly how to comply with security policies and how to perform their specific jobs securely. Training is showing the HR department exactly which encrypted portal to use when sending W-2 tax forms to the accounting firm.
And education is the why.
Education is detailed, deep dive learning, usually reserved for IT staff or security practitioners aiming for career advancement. Education is studying the underlying cryptographic math or studying for the CISSP itself. It builds overarching subject matter expertise.
How do we actually deliver this effectively to regular employees so they don't just click next, next, next on a boring annual PowerPoint presentation while checking their phones?
The techniques are evolving because PowerPoint doesn't change behavior. Phishing simulations are huge. They gather concrete metrics on who is clicking what, allowing you to provide targeted training to the repeat offenders. Gamification is increasingly being used to make learning engaging, utilizing leaderboards, escape room-style puzzles, and internal competitions to make security top of mind rather than a chore.
And I want to highlight a concept from the text that I think is brilliant. Security champions.
I love this concept. A security champion is a non-security person, maybe a lead software developer, a marketing manager, or an HR director, who receives extra training and becomes a liaison and subject matter expert for security within their own specific department.
So instead of the CISO constantly yelling at the marketing team to be secure, the marketing team has one of their own peers advocating for it.
Yes. They evangelize secure practices organically from the inside out. They translate complex security mandates into the language their specific department understands, which drastically reduces the friction between business units and the security office.
Well, we have covered an absolutely incredible amount of ground today. from the ethical canons and the CIA triad to the heavy legal implications of GDPR and the CFAA, through the time metrics of business continuity, all the way to quantitative risk, math, threat modeling, and supply chain cereal boxes. Let's wrap up this deep dive into Domain 1.
If you take one overarching concept away from this entire hour-long discussion, it's the core philosophy we started with. To pass the CISSP, and more importantly, to be a highly effective security leader in the real world, you must think like a manager. It's not about knowing how to configure the command line syntax on a Cisco firewall. It's about proving due care to a judge. It's about justifying that firewall's cost to a board of directors using ALE quantitative math. It's about aligning that firewall with the strategic 5-year business goals. And above all else, in every scenario, it's ensuring human life safety.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We talked a lot today about the AAA framework, specifically the authentication pillar. One of the primary ways we prove something you are during authentication is by using biometrics, fingerprints, facial recognition, voice prints. It's supposed to be the gold standard of non-repudiation. But look at the emerging technologies mentioned in the updated exam objectives, specifically artificial intelligence. As AI and deepfakes evolve to perfectly mimic human voice and video in real time, how long until something you are can be perfectly and seamlessly spoofed by an algorithm?
That is a genuinely terrifying prospect for risk management.
Yeah.
How will organizations adjust their qualitative risk appetites when the threat vectors look and sound exactly like their own CEO authorizing a multi-million-dollar wire transfer over a live Zoom call? If you can't trust a live video feed, how do you verify authorization?
It is a risk management nightmare. And frankly, it's a puzzle that the next generation of CISSPs, maybe you listening right now, are going to have to solve as the frameworks adapt to an AI-driven world.
The technological landscape is always shifting, which is exactly why we rely on the foundational technology-agnostic frameworks we discussed today. Firewalls change, but the math of risk and the ethics of leadership do not.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the foundational domain of information security. Remember, the goal of leadership isn't absolute, perfect security. The goal is intelligently managed risk. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking like a manager.